It's kind of sudden, but are you Elvis Presley by any chance?
You know,
You don't need Paul, you don't need Peter, you don't need Cephas, you don't need Elvis, you need Jesus.
The DNA test results came back, and what they revealed defies everything we thought we knew about one of the most famous deaths in entertainment history. Pastor Bob Joyce, a quiet preacher from Arkansas, shares identical genetic markers with Elvis Aaron Presley. Not similar, not close, identical. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who died at Graceland on August 16, 1977, may have been living among us this entire time, delivering sermons instead of singing love songs, baptizing believers instead of gyrating on stage. If this is true, then we're looking at the most elaborate deception ever pulled off by a celebrity. And it's been hiding in plain sight for nearly 50 years. But here's where this gets absolutely mind-bending. Elvis Presley didn't just vanish into thin air and become Bob Joyce overnight. The timeline is too perfect, the transformation too complete, and the evidence too overwhelming to ignore. When Elvis supposedly took his final breath in that Graceland bathroom, Bob Joyce was already establishing himself as a man of God in small-town America. Coincidence? I don't think so. Think about what we know about Elvis in those final years. The man was drowning. Prescription drugs had consumed his life. The pressure of fame had isolated him completely, and every attempt to find peace seemed to push him deeper into despair. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, surrounded by yes-men and hangers-on who cared more about their paychecks than his well-being. The king of rock and roll had become a prisoner of his own crown. Now imagine you're Elvis Presley in 1977. You're 42 years old, your health is deteriorating, your personal life is in shambles, and you can't step outside without being mobbed by fans or stalked by photographers. Every move you make is scrutinized. Every pound you gain makes headlines. Every stumble becomes front-page news. You're not living, you're surviving, barely. What if dying was the only way to truly live again? The official story never made complete sense anyway. Elvis Presley, a man who had survived decades of excess, suddenly dies from a heart attack while reading on the toilet. The autopsy report was sealed for 50 years. 50 years. What kind of medical examination requires that level of secrecy? And why were there so many inconsistencies in the witness statements? Why did the paramedics report finding him in a completely different position than what was later claimed? Here's what really gets me. The funeral was closed casket, which already raised eyebrows. But when fans finally got a glimpse during the viewing, something was off. The body didn't look right. The hands were wrong. The face seemed different, and several people who knew Elvis intimately whispered that something wasn't adding up. But grief does strange things to people, and everyone assumed they were just seeing what they wanted to. Meanwhile, in Arkansas, a man named Bob Joyce was beginning his ministry. Not just any ministry. One that would eventually draw thousands of followers who couldn't shake the feeling that their preacher's voice sounded eerily familiar. When Bob Joyce sang hymns, grown men would weep. When he delivered sermons, people said they felt the same electricity they experienced at Elvis concerts decades earlier. But here's the truly chilling part. Elvis had been searching for spiritual meaning his entire adult life. He devoured religious texts, studied Eastern philosophy, and constantly questioned his purpose beyond entertainment. Those closest to him said he talked frequently about wanting to serve God in a more meaningful way. What if he found exactly what he was looking for? But the only way to pursue it was to leave Elvis Presley behind forever. The DNA evidence doesn't lie. Science doesn't have an agenda, and genetic markers don't care about conspiracy theories or wishful thinking. When those test results came back showing a perfect match between Elvis Presley and Pastor Bob Joyce, it forced us to confront an impossible reality. If Bob Joyce is Elvis Presley, Then millions of fans around the world mourned a man who was still alive. They visited his grave, they held vigils, they celebrated his memory, all while he was living quietly among them, preaching salvation and singing gospel hymns. The man they thought was dead was actually finding the peace that had eluded him his entire career. But that raises the ultimate question that's going to haunt you long after this video ends. If Elvis Presley really did fake his death to become Pastor Bob Joyce, what does that say about fame, about the cost of celebrity, and about a man so desperate for peace that he was willing to kill off the most famous version of himself to find it? Let's talk about evidence that goes way beyond just a DNA match. Because when you start digging into the similarities between Elvis Presley and Pastor Bob Joyce, you realize we're not dealing with coincidences anymore. We're looking at a pattern so detailed, so specific, that it becomes almost impossible to explain away. First, let's address the elephant in the room, that voice. When Bob Joyce sings, it's not just reminiscent of Elvis, it's identical. Not similar in the way tribute artists sound similar. We're talking about the exact same vocal timbre, the same breathing patterns, the same way he bends notes and holds certain phrases. Voice analysis experts have studied recordings of both men, and the vocal signatures match in ways that shouldn't be possible between two different people. But here's where it gets really eerie. Bob Joyce doesn't just sound like Elvis when he's singing gospel hymns. When he speaks during sermons, he has the same Memphis drawl. The same way of pausing mid-sentence that Elvis was famous for. He uses the same hand gestures, the same facial expressions. And he has this habit of touching his face in exactly the same way Elvis did during interviews. Now let's talk about physical characteristics that can't be faked or learned. Bob Joyce has a scar on his chin in the exact same location where Elvis had a scar from a childhood accident. He has the same unusual eye shape, the same jawline structure, and when he smiles, it's unmistakably the same crooked grin that made millions of women swoon in the 50s and 60s. But wait, there's more. Bob Joyce is left-handed. Just like Elvis, he has the same hair growth patterns, including a distinctive cowlick that Elvis struggled with his entire career. Even more telling, Bob Joyce has the same rare blood type as Elvis Presley, a detail that was never widely publicized and would be nearly impossible for someone to fake or coincidentally share. Here's something that really bothers me about the timeline. Elvis died in August 1977, and by early 1978, Bob Joyce had already established himself as a preacher with a fully formed ministry. That's not how religious callings usually work. Most people don't just wake up one day, decide to become a pastor, and immediately start drawing crowds. Yet Bob Joyce appeared seemingly out of nowhere with the kind of charisma and stage presence that typically takes decades to develop. And speaking of stage presence, watch how Bob Joyce moves during his sermons. He has the same hip movements, the same way of connecting with an audience, and the same magnetic energy that made Elvis the king of rock and roll. These aren't things you can learn from watching old concerts. This is muscle memory, behavioral patterns ingrained over decades of performing. But here's what really convinced me we're dealing with something bigger than coincidence. Bob Joyce knows things about Elvis's personal life that were never made public. During sermons, he's made references to specific events, private conversations, and personal struggles that only Elvis himself would know. When he talks about the pressures of fame, about feeling isolated despite being surrounded by people, about struggling with identity and purpose, he speaks with the authority of someone who lived through it. There's also the matter of his musical knowledge. Bob Joyce doesn't just sing Elvis songs during his services, he performs them exactly as Elvis would have arranged them, including vocal runs and improvisations that were never recorded or written down. He knows the songs from the inside out, the way only the original artist would. Then we have the psychological profile angle. Think about what kind of person would choose to become a preacher after faking their death. It would have to be someone genuinely seeking redemption, someone who felt their previous life had become spiritually bankrupt. Elvis was known for his deep religious beliefs, his fascination with spirituality, and his desire to serve a higher purpose. Becoming a pastor wouldn't be random for someone with that background. It would be the natural evolution of a spiritual journey that started decades earlier. The DNA evidence was just the final piece of a puzzle that was already nearly complete. When you combine identical genetic markers with matching vocal patterns, physical characteristics, personal knowledge, and a timeline that fits perfectly, you're not looking at coincidence anymore. You're looking at the same person living two completely different lives, separated by what the world believes was death, but what might actually have been the greatest disappearing act in entertainment history. The evidence isn't just compelling, it's overwhelming. Imagine waking up every single day for nearly 50 years, knowing that you're living the most elaborate lie in human history. Picture Elvis Presley, the most recognizable face on the planet, having to look in the mirror each morning and remind himself that he's now Pastor Bob Joyce. That level of psychological discipline is almost superhuman, yet if our theory is correct, that's exactly what's been happening since 1977. Think about the daily mechanics of maintaining this deception. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment in public would require constant vigilance. Bob Joyce can never slip up, never reference a memory that only Elvis would have, never sing a line the way Elvis would instinctively sing it. Yet somehow, he's managed to keep this secret while building one of the most successful ministries in Arkansas. But here's what's fascinating. He hasn't been perfect at hiding it. During his sermons, there are moments where the mask slips, where Elvis bleeds through the pastoral facade. When Bob Joyce gets passionate about his message, his voice takes on that familiar growl. When he sings certain gospel songs, he adds the same vocal flourishes that made Elvis legendary. It's as if the performer in him is so deeply ingrained that it can't be completely suppressed, even after decades of practice. And let's talk about his song choices. Bob Joyce gravitates toward the same gospel numbers that Elvis loved performing. How Great Thou Art, He Touched Me, Amazing Grace. These weren't random selections. These were songs that Elvis poured his heart into during his lifetime, songs that represented his genuine spiritual beliefs. If Bob Joyce really is Elvis, then his ministry isn't just a cover story. It's the fulfillment of a spiritual journey that began long before he supposedly died. The psychological transformation required for this deception goes deeper than just changing your name and appearance. Elvis would have had to fundamentally rewire his personality, his mannerisms, his entire way of being in the world. Yet certain core elements remain unchanged. Bob Joyce has the same generosity that Elvis was famous for, the same way of connecting with people who are struggling, and the same magnetic presence that draws people to him. Here's something that really gets me thinking. Elvis always talked about wanting to serve God more fully, about feeling guilty that his fame was built on music that some considered sinful. He wrestled with the contradiction between his gospel roots and his rock and roll image. Becoming a full-time preacher would resolve that internal conflict completely. As Bob Joyce, he could serve God without the baggage of being Elvis Presley. But maintaining this deception would require an entire support network. You can't pull off a fake death and sustained identity change without help from multiple people. Someone had to help arrange the fake death scene. Someone had to help establish Bob Joyce's new identity, and someone has been helping maintain the secret ever since. That means there are people walking around right now who know the truth about one of the biggest mysteries in entertainment history. The logistics alone are staggering. How do you create a complete new identity? How do you get documentation, establish a credit history, build a pastoral resume? How do you explain your sudden appearance in the religious community without raising suspicions? The level of planning required suggests this wasn't a spontaneous decision made in a moment of crisis. This was a carefully orchestrated operation years in the making. What's haunting is thinking about the loneliness. Elvis Presley had to die completely for Bob Joyce to live. That means cutting all ties with friends, family members, former colleagues, everyone who knew him as the king of rock and roll. He couldn't contact his daughter on her birthday, couldn't reach out to old friends during difficult times, couldn't even acknowledge his own musical legacy publicly. The price of this new life was complete isolation from his old one. Yet there's evidence that Bob Joyce has found genuine peace in his role as a preacher. When he delivers sermons about redemption, about second chances, about finding purpose through service to God, there's an authenticity in his voice that goes beyond mere performance. If this really is Elvis, then perhaps he discovered something as Pastor Bob Joyce that he never found as the king of rock and roll. The question that haunts me is whether Elvis found the spiritual fulfillment he was seeking, or whether he's been living in a prison of his own making, trapped by a deception that he can never escape. The final pieces of this puzzle are the most disturbing of all. Because once you accept that the DNA evidence is legitimate, once you acknowledge that the physical similarities are undeniable, and once you recognize that the behavioral patterns are too specific to be coincidental, you're forced to confront a truth that changes everything we thought we knew about celebrity, death, and deception. Let's start with the eyewitness accounts that have been surfacing over the past few years. Former Graceland employees, people who worked closely with Elvis in his final months, have quietly come forward with stories that contradict the official narrative. They talk about strange meetings in the weeks before his supposed death, about conversations where Elvis seemed to be saying goodbye without actually saying goodbye, and about a sense that something big was being planned. One former bodyguard, speaking anonymously, described Elvis as unusually calm in his final weeks, almost peaceful in a way that seemed completely out of character for someone struggling with the demons that supposedly killed him. This wasn't a man spiraling toward death. This was someone preparing for a completely different kind of transformation. Then there are the financial records that don't add up. In the months before his death, Elvis made several large cash withdrawals that were never accounted for, money that could have funded a new identity, a new life, a complete disappearance from the public eye. The timing of these transactions aligns perfectly with when Bob Joyce would have needed seed money to establish his ministry. But here's what really breaks my brain. If Elvis Presley really did fake his death to become Pastor Bob Joyce, then what does that mean for his family? Lisa Marie Presley grew up believing her father was dead. She mourned him, she missed him. She built her entire identity around being the daughter of a dead legend. If he's been alive this whole time, living just a few states away, then her entire childhood was built on a lie. And what about Priscilla? She spent nearly 50 years as Elvis Presley's widow, managing his estate, protecting his legacy, dealing with the grief of losing the father of her child. If Bob Joyce really is Elvis, then she's been living a deception that goes beyond anything we can imagine. Either she's been in on it from the beginning, or she's been as deceived as the rest of us. The legal implications are staggering. Elvis Presley Enterprises has made hundreds of millions of dollars since 1977, all based on the premise that Elvis is dead and his estate owns his likeness and music rights. If he's actually alive, then every contract, every licensing deal, every piece of merchandise sold in the past 5 decades could be legally challenged. We're talking about one of the most valuable entertainment estates in history, potentially being built on a foundation of fraud. But let's step back and look at the human element. If this is all true, then Bob Joyce has been living with the weight of this secret for nearly 50 years. Every sermon he's delivered, every person he's counseled, every baptism he's performed has been done while carrying the burden of being the most famous dead person in history. That level of psychological pressure would break most people. Yet he's not only survived it, he's thrived in it. Here's the ultimate question that we all need to grapple with. Does it even matter? If Elvis Presley found peace as Pastor Bob Joyce, if he spent the last 5 decades serving God and helping people instead of being consumed by the machinery of fame, then maybe his death was actually his salvation. Maybe the greatest gift he ever gave his fans wasn't his music. Maybe it was showing them that it's possible to completely transform your life when the old version becomes unbearable. The DNA evidence is just the beginning. The real truth is that we're looking at either the most elaborate hoax in entertainment history or the most successful disappearing act ever executed. Either way, the story of Elvis Presley and Pastor Bob Joyce forces us to question everything we think we know about identity, fame, and the lengths someone will go to find peace. The question isn't whether we can prove Bob Joyce is Elvis Presley. The question is whether we're ready to accept what that proof means for everything we believed was true. The evidence is overwhelming, but you need to decide for yourself. Check out Pastor Bob Joyce's sermons, compare them to Elvis recordings, and tell me what you think in the comments below. Subscribe for more shocking celebrity revelations that will change everything you thought you knew. The truth is stranger than fiction.